give you a quick background, not so much about me and my work, because that you can easily, if you're interested, you can either go to my CV, you can download a lot of things from there, all free of charge, or you can go to the P&O or even Jensen, right? If you are interested, I can collate some of these videos or talks or articles, non-scientific articles, so that you and your group, like in the divisions and so on, can take a look. Right? But I do want to contextualize for you a few things. Each time I share about public trust to either political leaders or to more internal groups. Trust, of course, is very important. In Singapore's context, it goes back quite some time. But in 2013, in March, I did a study for NSCS, that's the National Security Coordination Secretary at P&O, Prime Minister's Office. I think Benny was the PS, a former police officer. I still work closely with him now on other things. So he and his group thought it's very important to get an idea of trust. We then look at trust with the view of sharing with the cabinet ministers what we know about the science of public trust. Now remember 2013, so 10 years ago. The word public trust 10 years ago, you probably don't even really hear it much in the media, right? Unlike say in the last few years, you hear Ming Shan and all in the parliament and others talking about it. So in 2013, I thought, yeah, this is a very important thing. I then took on the challenge, and together with somebody else, so we reviewed 17 disciplines. Academic discipline, meaning like psychology is one discipline, political science another, strategy, management, OB, and so on. So we look at 17 disciplines that we can get hold of and try to look at what public trust, what they say about trust. So we end up looking at even things like, say, in the British UK Parliament, when you have scandals, what happens when trust is broken, what do people do? Do people go and then apologize? Is apology always the best way to go? What about trust in teachers and students when you break trust, the CEO when you break trust, and things like that. So we look at the word trust and look at all the disciplines, because my belief is that when we want to look at a practical real-world issue, no discipline has all the answers. So although I'm a psychologist, I cannot just look at psychology, right? So at a certain point, very clear, we look at what we try to figure out from 17 disciplines. And lo and behold, what I'm going to share with you is really a product of something we started in 2013. There are more commonalities than actually we thought, and even I thought right before I embarked on the review. Right? So even we look at different disciplines, they tend to converge and tell us quite the same thing about trust. Right? So when I say psychology or public trust, I don't want you to walk away thinking that, oh, that's David Chan from a psychological perspective. Actually, it's based on multiple disciplines. And now my duty here is to try and translate for you what I think the science and practice of trust mean. How science can inform practice, practice can inform science. So that was, I think at least Singapore is concerned, in 2013 I did that. Half a year later, 2018, almost exactly half a year later, I decided to write an article and go public after I've already done my job, shared with through Benny, with the cabinet and others, a few select group into leadership, and then I give them half a year to think about it. Then of course I didn't check with them, right? I'm not a public officer, I'm police, so I can do whatever I want. So in 2013, half a year later, I wrote an article for Straits Times and about public trust, right? In fact, your DC Jerry was referring to this article when we had a chat just now over lunch. That's where I now remember now it's in Straits Times so everybody can read, and I basically talk about the different dimensions of trust, what it means. I probably didn't use the word police. Well, I used the police in one of the sentences as examples of what does it mean to have high trust and so on. And I'll go through some of the things with you. But interestingly, then 2 days later, Prime Minister Lee at Public Service Leadership Advance, right? This is kind of a ceremonial promotion dinner for both the AO and PSL, public service leaders. It's not a retreat. At that time, they start calling it a lunch already. Right? That was 10 years ago. And he talked about the importance of trust. Of course, although it's a dinner, but it always get reported in media, so it went public. Right? That was probably, as far as I can recall, where it comes right from the top, out there, reminding not our officers, but going public and talk about the importance of people-centered leadership as well as public trust. Fortunately, what he said, what I said 2 days ago, did not contradict. Of course, if you go back all the way, we are all in a way behind closed doors. Although I didn't talk to PM directly about this, right? When we talk, it's always about other things, but through his own stuff, of course, I'm sure we know what each other were going to say. Now from 2013, because of OSA, I won't go into details, there are various kind of studies I've done for our public service on public trust and related issues. Right? Sometimes it's not called trust, it might be couched in terms of values and so on, but invariably it goes back to the issue of trust. So we actually have a lot of internal findings unpublished about trust. Trust from our own public officers, trust about the public. You have a lot of data on trust, right? Gallup will have data on trust, right? We know our police force ranking on trust globally as well. So there's actually no lack of evidence, not only in the academic literature, but even in the actual practice, right, on what our people think about us, about you, and what our own officers think about our own leadership and so on. We were just also saying, talking about this at lunch, the interesting thing is that most of these surveys are anonymous, or they are written in a way, done in a way that it is highly unlikely that the people are quite afraid to say what they really want to say. So when you get high levels of trust, such as our SPF, even if we discount it a little bit based on certain social desirability responding on the survey, we are not too far off. Okay? So if you get 96% of the Singaporeans saying that they trust you, the truth is probably about 90%, right? Which is pretty high, right, by any global standards. So those are good news. Of course, the purpose here is not just to celebrate our high trust, it's to talk about can we maintain that level of trust. You really can't go much above 96. If you always get 99, it's probably not a good survey. Right? 96 is quite ideal. But if you get 100, you can only get it in some parts of China. Okay, then in 2018, I did a conference. You heard about the BSI. Every year we do a conference. We get people like Tommy Koh, all the people who are public intellectuals, get media, Han Fu Guang, and all this. So I always bring them together. Very few academics, usually one or two of myself and all, and we do a conference, then we look into a book, right? So that even if the media doesn't report our conference, I will send the book around so that people and leaders especially get a copy. So your CP, the DC all got probably a copy of my book every year, forcing them to read things that I thought that everybody should read and so on. So there was this 2018 one, every year we do a conference, right? We did something on public trust. This book is quite interesting. We document verbatim what happened in the conference, so you get different views, not just my view, but other people's view, and including the Q&A discussion, the kinds of questions that the type of audience will ask about public trust. And so those of you who are interested can take a look. And then in 2019, I was invited to write this article for MND. MND has this urban solution thing. The only reason I show you this is that it also gives you probably a reasonable framework of what I want to say today about trust. But this is a globally circulated sort of journal, or rather magazine, to 30,000 mayors around the world. Right? So Singapore was hosting the World City Summit, and there was the particular year, 2019, I think we talked about trust. I wasn't at that conference actually, but I was asked to write it, so I went ahead and write, and Tommy Koh wrote another article. And that gets circulated. Of course, globally, actually the world thinks very highly about Singapore in terms of trust, not only in enforcement, but in things like urban planning and so on. And we were trying to argue that in a high trust city, there's a lot of things sometimes planning and architecture never consider. You need to look at the psychology of trust as well. Right? That's where I came in. Okay, then I'll finish off with these two and then go to the real meat of the chat with you. Of course, no talk is meaningful now without talking about COVID. Right? Since last 2.5 years, we have been all basically COVIDed psychologically in every sense of the word. I wrote this book, I published it in June, the day before PM announced that general election is going to be on this day, and then I just clicked send to the publisher because then I didn't have to write about general election. So I submitted this just a minute before he announced the GE. That was in June or July, June, I think it got published. So January 23rd, if you recall, was the first case for COVID that came to Singapore, right? Somebody came from Guangzhou airport, I think. And I thought it was very important to document about trust and COVID, the psychology of managing COVID. So in this book, there's a lot of things inside that I talk about trust, right? About Trace Together, If you recall, right, you guys were not uninvolved, right, in terms of trace together, the issues of trust, issue of how we deal with the data, issue of working from home and all. Right? So all those things are documented 6 months into the pandemic. Of course, now there are a lot of things that are not in this book. We are already 2.5 years. Right? The reason I have on a side thing to share with you, I think very much like a police officer. I cannot wait for the COVID to be over to write something. I don't know when COVID will be over, true enough, right? It took at least 2.5 years before we are where we are today. And I thought that if there are important lessons to learn, you need to learn, we all need to learn together fast, right? In the same way that unlike the Hotel New World collapse, which by the way I was one of the officers at the scene in the 1984 Hotel New World collapse, unlike an incident in the police you are used to, where your incident management is very clear, you have the start point, you have the incident going on, then you have the end point. Right? Even in the terrorist event, you have a start episode and the episode end. You can talk about prevention, response, recovery, social resilience, but the crisis or the incident is temporally fixed. Right? It's very clear what is the start. That is not what COVID was. Right? When COVID started, nobody knows what is it. It's not really one incident, it's multifaceted. We don't know when it will end. Is it really ended today? We still cannot reach, it's still debatable. So my argument is that unlike a typical incident, you cannot wait for an incident over to learn from an incident through a case study. Right? You need to deal with it as it progresses. So Minister Gan and others who are on the committee of the task force also reference this and some of the other writings, right, where we talk about the importance of trust, which everybody agrees. This is the final thing I want to share with you. I think about background of trust is that, so in SID is not intelligence department. SID is the Singapore Institute of Directors. And so, not SID. The SID cannot put on the slide. So, SID is this institute, Singapore Institute, whereby most directors of all kinds of boards. So when we are directors of boards, we're supposed to learn how to be a director. So there's this institute that tries to develop directors and so on, right? Especially for new directors. So they have this very glossy, important bulletin, quarterly bulletin, and they asked me to write something on trust. And this was shared quite widely because trust is not just a political issue, it's also about society, employees, and organization. So as police leaders, all 60 of you here, I think 60 of you here are leaders, and you have basically you have your own unit sort of under you, right? And to them, you are the leader, right? Of course, CP is your leader, but to them, you are the leader the most immediate leader they look up to. And so I think learning about trust is very important. So with that, I'll go straight into the content of the trust thing, right? And then I'd like to have more time to discuss with you about policing, policing, or hear from you about your comments. Let's go through the very obvious things which you all know, but because even though police is homogeneous, I'm sure there's some heterogeneity among you, right? So like every class that I take, I always make sure I give the background to make sure everybody's on the same page. So I think we all agree that there's an economics and politics of trust. In the economics of trust means that actually we cannot do any transaction if there's no trust. If you and your vendor cannot even have basic trust, right, you cannot talk about your quotations, so you cannot talk about getting things done, the delivery and so on. So even in the private sector and in any transaction, the trust is actually, there's an economic basis of it. Okay, so that's important. Most of us are familiar with the politics of trust, right? Without trust, nobody will vote you into power, right? But politics is not just partisan politics, it's also politics within an organization, right? So without trust, if LG has a lot of trust, I know, right? But let's suppose we are another organization around the boardroom table. If I don't have trust to my fellow commander equivalent, I say another unit head, right? Then there will be some things that I will be very careful when I say, right? In front of the CEO, I will say certain things. I may not say everything. I may not say what I mean. I may not mean what I say because I have another unit person there. In fact, if I have a very good idea in my unit, will I share it with the CEO? If I'm competing with the other fellow unit equivalent of commander like a head, I won't because he may steal my idea and so on. Right? So that comes down to the element of trust. So if Echo Division, Echo Commander here, if Echo Division came up with a wonderful idea that we're going to benefit from all divisions, when there is trust, right, Echo Commander will share it quite freely about what he or he did in this division, right? As opposed to another situation where somebody will not share because we are competing and Right? So those are important economics and politics of trust. But I thought today it's important to remind us from second point onwards, right, that we didn't pay too much attention. That trust actually is a social psychological phenomenon. So you can be a political party, for example, PAP, right? Let's say PAP is objectively very trustworthy in this particular aspect. But if the PAP's communication or engagement is no good, then the public will still not trust you. So you need to distinguish objective trustworthiness with perceived trust. Right? And trust is actually a perception. Right? So Jerry could be objectively very trustworthy, right? He's telling the truth and everything. Then if I don't know, or if I get some false information, then what Jerry say, I will still not trust him. But that's not because Jerry is not trustworthy. He's objectively trustworthy, but there was some problem in between, right? Either because he didn't communicate, or somebody said something like false about him and he didn't know, and so he kind of cannot even have a chance to correct it. And that somebody is somebody I told me something, and so I just perceived Jerry in a particular way, right? So objective trustworthiness is very important, but the most important is the subjective perception of the trust. Because whether David will now go out and talk good or bad about Jerry, whether David will say yes or no to Jerry's invitation for something, will depend on my perception of him, right? It will not depend actually directly on his objective trustworthiness. Okay, so and we don't have time for him to correct and say, oh, I realize I made a mistake, actually he's trustworthy. Because in between, I would have done a lot of damage. You know, I could have committed a crime, I could have done something, I could have spread all things bad about Jerry and so on. And it will be too late by the time I realized that, oh, I was wrong, Jerry was right. Too late, right? Because I caused too much damage. And that's where we must come from. We need to build our SPF or the political party its objective trustworthiness. But if you fail to understand that the proximate cause of people's action and attitude is the subjective perception, then you will be always behind time. And damage control is not going to address the issue. Okay? And hence, the psychology of public trust is really critical, right? I would argue. And it cannot be your opinion and my opinion, right? So it has to be based on evidence. That's the way I look at things, right? And I believe in a scientist practitioner model. I should only be a consultant and say things that I know from evidence, right? So I've been consultant for 30 over years to various agencies. I dare say that I don't make a recommendation if it's not based on evidence. If it's only based on my opinion, you should not pay me, right? You can just hear people's opinion freely and so on. And so we need to contextualize trust, and that's the purpose of today's session. But very quickly, I will go through this very, very quickly, right? If I were talking this to my PhD student, I would take a lot more time. But to people like you, no problem, right? Very quickly. Infrastructure, we need to deal with trust, right? One of the problems in our population's white paper, remember population white paper, there were a lot of hoo-ha. On the day where population white paper was being debated, after that, PM had lunch with a few ministers and me, just to sort of relax and talk about it. Like, you can really see the emotions involved in our ministers and PM himself, because the debate was very, very involved, right? It was very clear government thought they knew what they were doing, but the reaction even from the MPs, your own party, not just to mention the public, was quite unexpected, I think, from most of them. And so that's a very important lesson, because the reaction was not just outside, it was inside Parliament with 80 over MPs, which are really a close group of people. It's almost like our leaders here with 60 of you, suddenly you reacted in a way that we as like PC and CP never thought of. Right? It's that kind of situation which is very unusual. Right? And I would argue that one of the problems at that time was a trust and competence issue. Right? The public were all very concerned because, I remember this was approximating 2015 GE where the party actually didn't do well. What happened was that the population was going up very quickly, the infrastructure was not catching up. That was one of the main reasons, right? You had all the local foreigner defecting, but the main reason was that MRT was crowded, the buses took a long time to come. So that was actually a case of trust in competence, right? And we did not trust that the government can solve the problem if you continue to have this number of foreigners coming in and so on. And so it wasn't a trust, just a general trust. It was a particular aspect of trust. It was competence. You can't manage. You can't even manage your infrastructure. Why are you talking about bringing more people? Right? And that drove every other things, right? Then of course later jobs and so on. And later we'll talk about different dimensions of trust. Information you know very well, right? All the fake news, all the POCMA, all the false information. Do you trust what people say? When there's an incident, the police PAD put out a statement, you know. Do people trust what the PAD or what the police clarified even in terms of the facts? So it's one thing for you to come out and say the facts. You actually assume and you hope and you need to work on it to make sure that when people read the facts from the police, those are the facts, right? Vis-a-vis things that you heard before or after the PAD statement. Enforcement, you know very well about impartiality in enforcing, you know, when you do a search and things like that, who you arrest and don't arrest, you know, in a illegal assembly and so on. Our difficult social challenge is the illegal assembly can be defined with one person. I always have a bit of problem with that, frankly speaking. Assembly, right? By definition, in assembly. Last time we were taught in police, 5 people or more illegal assembly. You know, and now suddenly one person illegal assembly, a bit hard to understand. You assemble who? So, okay, but that's the law, and that's what you deal with, and then you are caught in between, you didn't make the law, you then have to kind of deal with it and so on. Okay? I won't go into social integration resilience, a big topic by itself, but when there are times we have opportunity, if you talk about resilience and integration, you will find that the fundamental concept dealing with is trust. Okay? Trust between people, for example, between groups, be it race group or other emerging groups. Okay. So the meat of it is really these 3 M's, right? If you forget about everything I say, maybe just remember the morning of the 3 M's. Trust is multi-level, trust is multi-dimensional, and trust is malleable. Okay, when you remember these 3 M's, I think it will help you a lot as a leader, right? If you try to either prevent trust erosion or repair trust if you have violated trust, or develop trust and build trust. Okay, let's go through this very quickly. Most of you know everything. I'm just trying to put together a framework for you to like discuss after this talk. Trust, of course, is individual. I've already mentioned that. It's all social psychological. It's about my perception. So at the individual level, when it is individual level, then you need to understand David Chan now, right? You also need to understand Jerry, because I'm the truster, he's the trustee. I'm trying to see, should I trust this guy? And he, as a trustee, is the person that whether we trust or don't trust, right? Most of the time, we assume he wants my trust, right? So we assume the trustee wants the trust of the truster. The truster and the trustee, for example, public is truster, ruling party say is trustee, CEO trustee, employees truster. Actually, don't forget, trust and trustee relationship is asymmetrical. The truster has a vulnerable position. So for me to say I trust you, right, actually it means that I have decided to put myself in a vulnerable position. It's exactly what you learn in OPS, you know, you're going to fall down or you're going to hold me or not. That is basically, you put yourself in a vulnerable position. If you don't hold me, I'm going to bang my head, you know. So you need to appreciate about trust is before we complain about people don't trusting us, whatever. For the person to trust you, the person is actually putting himself or herself in a vulnerable position, going based on your word. What if you go against your word? What if you can't deliver? So when the commander trusts your DO, right, and say, okay, you're going to give this to me, I'm going to go and share it at LG Group with CP, right? The commander is at stake, right? If the DO doesn't deliver, the commander won't have the report ready for the LG meeting. So the commander actually now becomes a truster, the DO is the trustee, but the commander has put himself in a vulnerable position. So when the DO doesn't perform and the commander gets angry, in this case commander is truster, first you need to understand how you as commander will know how angry you are, right? Because now you go to CP, you know what to say, right? In a way not your fault, you trusted the DO, okay? Now you translate that anger that you had with you to the public, then you will understand, right? The public and your officers were trying to put their trust in you. When rightly or wrongly they perceived that you violated their trust, they felt how you felt when you were walking into the LG in CP waiting for you to say something and you don't have your report. But that is a similar kind of finding, right? Because they put themselves in a vulnerable position and you violated their trust, right? And so trust, just like fairness, is very, very raw, very fundamental, and when it is violated, it's not an academic thing, it is a real thing. It leads to a whole different perception of you as an individual and so on. So we need to understand the psychology of it. Then the second point I want to make is that trust is also at the team and organizational level. When our officers look at the SPF leadership, the officer is not actually thinking about CP or DC Jerry as an individual. You think about SPF leadership. Okay? So if you ask me, David, do you trust the 4G leaders? Actually, I don't have to think about Heng Swee Keat, Lawrence Wong, or Yi Kang to answer. I will just have an answer to you quite spontaneously. Because I already have an abstract representation of the 4G leaders. So your officer actually have an abstract representation of the SPF leadership as a trustee. Okay, so there is actually a trust at the team or the organization level. But ironically, it takes only one individual to mess up for that perception of the team to change. It doesn't require all the 4G leaders or more than 50 to mess up. It only requires one 4G leader to do something very bad or say something horrible, and David might lose or decreases his trust of the 4G leaders. So the point here is that as LG, all of you, it actually takes only one or two of you here in this room to actually mess up the officer's perception of the LG group. Okay, and hence it is so important how we deal with, how we maintain the trust, not just the average of the team, right, but even something like one person's behavior. So if you think about whether it's traced together or other things, right, everybody recognizes the collective responsibility and impact you have, whether you're a cabinet minister, but it's not about you, but it's about the entire cabinet, for example. Groups we also know very well. There are issues about varieties of groups. Most academic research did not pay enough attention to this, but you and I know this very well in Singapore. We talk about the trust between Chinese, Malay, Indian, others race. We talk about trust between religious groups. So there are group at the intergroup level, right? So David, as a Chinese person, you can ask me, do I trust Malay Singaporeans as a group? My best friend happened to be Malay. He's a police officer that I know in 18 years, so he's still my best friend, right? But when you ask me, you can still ask me, David, do you trust Malay Singaporeans? I may or may not think about my best friend, his name is Sapuan, right? But I will still have a representation of Malay Singaporeans. So you can talk about intergroup trust. Today, you and I have to deal with cohesion issues, no longer just race and religion. We have to deal with emergent groups, right? The latest, of course, your 377A, your pro versus your anti-377A retail. But there are also other groups like social divides, young and old, people of different agencies. So understanding trust at the intergroup level is something that actually we academics don't know, are not doing a good job to translate that into practice. There's a lot of research on intergroup relations, but I think there's no effort to translate that research into our dealing of cohesion. In Singapore, my own view is that a lot of our practice, we are very good in race and religion managing it, although it's very volatile. But we might not be very good yet at dealing with other emergent groups, which are very different from race and religion, and we can talk about some of that if we have time. You are most interested in this, so is the political parties, right? And that is when we say trust and public trust, we tend to think about our trust in Singapore's government, right? I don't know good or bad, but our issue is that the public, the Singaporean, tend to equate Singapore with ruling government, tend to with PAP, actually with police force, Singapore Public Service Centre. Right? Public service is supposed to be impartial, and you are in many ways, right? But for the public, they look at it as a sort of a similar thing. Okay, so separate the part that what it ought to be, what it maybe is, with the perception. The public will look at SPF very different from they look at the government, right? They go and lump all of you together. And so how well you do and how well they do affect each other, right? There is a spillover effect. Okay, so very quickly, second part, that's that the trust is multi-level, understand the different levels and therefore different types of trust. The second main thing I want to share with you, spend a little bit of time on this one, is that trust is multi-dimensional. Strictly speaking, the question, do you trust the Singapore Police Force? Strictly speaking, most people cannot answer that question yet. Because they will say, trust you in which aspect? Correct? So if I ask you, do you trust David Chan? Even though you have known me for some time, let's say, actually that question is not very meaningful. You can ask, for example, are you saying, do I trust David's competence? That means, does he know what he's talking about? Is he a real psychologist? Can he speak properly? That's competence. Which is very different from, am I honest? Am I dishonest? Right? Do I have scandals? That is a trust in my integrity. Right? So your trust in my competence and your trust in my integrity are different. Correct? So trust is multi-dimensional. You must go down and say what kind of trust. But before that, the trust is ultimately based on the truster's propensity to trust. Right? How you trust David is not just David's action. Right? It's also about you. What is it about you? Like, do you trust CP? How about it's about you, not just CP? And what is it about you? It is about your beliefs about CP, your beliefs about human nature. Right? It is about your expectation. What you expect a CP to do or a commander to do. Right? If your expectation and my expectation are very different, and CP or commander does exactly the same thing, he might violate one person's trust but meet the trust levels of the other. Right? So the truster's propensity to trust is dependent on what he believes in, so the information and facts are important. What he expects, so we all need to understand people's expectations, because unmet expectations is the biggest driver of negative attitudes. Unmet expectation is the biggest driver of negative attitudes. That's a very important statement to bear and how they perceive given the context. Now, in the 2013 article that DC Jerry and I talked about at lunch, and I showed you that in Straits Times, that is the basic framework I shared, which we both thought is important to reinforce for you. That if you forget everything today, please remember these three bullets. Right? That trust can be divided into three relatively distinct dimensions. Right? And that is trust in a person's competence, a person's integrity, and benevolence. Competence is very clear. Can you solve my problems? That's the competence. So when I think that the government cannot solve my transport problems, MRT overcrowded, that is about my public trust in the government's competence. Right? Nothing to do with whether you are honest or not. Like, can you solve my problems or not? Okay, so police competence very clear. Can you arrest a murderer? When you have one person running with a baton, you have 4 persons with arm and taser. Can you actually do it? Right? So if I look at a video running around and I concluded that 4 police officers cannot hold out to a person, I will lose trust in the police. What? Not integrity, right? But your competence. Okay? Integrity is something that we know so well, right? It's about your character. So the first two is competence and character. Integrity is about, are you honest? Are you incorruptible? Are you telling lies? And even in the case of police, do you have visit places of ill repute, for example? Right? You take pride. So those are integrity issues. It is Minister Shan will agree with me completely on what I'm about to say, right? So as MPO, right? That is that we are not saying that the police needs to be totally corrupt-free or have no integrity cases, right? Such units don't exist in the world, right? There will always be corruption everywhere. The question is therefore not only the number of cases, but how you deal with the cases. So for the public, they want to see how you deal with trust violation. So if our police officer did something wrong, and it's pretty clear, they need to be assured, right, that you dealt with it swiftly, promptly, and without fear or favor. Right? And that part is not just political speak. To the extent that we thought that it is not dealt with fairly, the whole police force, our trust in your integrity will be eroded. Competence, integrity, we are very familiar with, right? But I want to spend a little bit of time on the third one, which I think most of us are not so familiar with. And you are not alone, right? You are just like everybody, every other leader, right? We found that most leaders tend to neglect the third point. Most leaders know competence, no integrity, and they just, in fact, for a long time, our PAP government has been saying competence and character, right? It's basically the first two. Then we kind of stop there. Benevolence is about intentions. Benevolence is about, do you say what you mean? Do you mean what you say? Right? So if I have a policy, if I'm the government and I say I want more foreigners to come in, because when more foreigners come in, it's ultimately for Singapore, because it creates jobs for Singapore, there's a bigger pie to trigger down effect. Do you believe that's the reason why I want foreigners to come in? If you do, then you have a trust in my benevolence, my good intention. I say what I mean what I say. So another example, right? From the work from home, right? Less applicable to you guys, I think maybe for other agencies, right? Let's say you go and follow quite strictly BSD rule about guidelines about 2 days work from home. Right? Imagine you are, say, another ministry, not police. And then your boss tells you that, we all work 2 days from home, that's fine. But can everybody please come back on Thursday? Everybody come back on Thursday. And the reason we come back on Thursday is that if we work from home, we lose the camaraderie, kind of like need to get to know each other. So everybody will come back on Thursday just to catch up so that we check on each other and so on. Do your employees believe you? If they thought that you want everybody to come back to Thursday just because you don't like the idea of work from home, or you just want to check on people and then you say it's for social cohesion, then there is no trust in benevolence. Okay, so what we say, how people think that what are our intentions, are we authentic, in other words, is quite different from the serious thing about integrity. But that is the thing that you and I neglect most. Research found that competence and integrity is quite obvious. Leaders neglect benevolence. Okay, we just say things and then we forget that whether people think that we are well-intentioned, we mean it, and what we say and we say what we mean. I would argue that, but I know you guys are working with trust, but I would argue that it's very important for you to try and think about instances where, out of good intentions, out of good character and good competence, but you may be violating benevolence. Right? I think of those situations, and they definitely exist, so that you can address them. In Singapore, I think that is the biggest problem. In Singapore, I think we are quite good at competence and integrity. We are not very good at building trust and benevolence. That's why your engagement all comes in. Okay, the final point here is that trust is multi-level, trust is multi-dimensional. Now you think about time, that over time, actually, trust can change. Trust is malleable, okay? This sounds political speak, actually it's based on research, right? Trust is very, very hard to build, right? Trust is very easy to lose, and once you lose it or lost, it is very difficult to restore. This statement is not just political speak, it's based on research, right? The research shows that it's very, very hard to build trust. It requires a lot of effort, a long time. It's very, very easy to lose, and once lost, it's very difficult to restore. Just imagine you said something to your wife, and then your wife didn't believe you and didn't trust you, right? All your years of relationship, sometimes overnight, can get eroded quite seriously, even though you took years to build that trusting relationship, right? It took a long time sometimes to restore that trust, right? It could be due to a misunderstanding, in fact. But what the research tells us also is that trust is very dynamic, and there are two important points. This especially for P&O, PPSD, all these, if you start looking on research, be very careful when you say, what do you mean by trust can change and trust is malleable? Okay, I try to put it into layperson's term from the research. What it means is that your trust level can change either gradually or suddenly. This is totally applicable to you at PAP. Okay, come again. Trust can change gradually or suddenly. It means that if you look at your trust barometer, your trust measures in the police or in PAP or Singapore, we are very high, right? We were never so high, right? In the 1960s, 70s, we were not high, right? There were police corruption, people look at politicians with colored eyes. But no, when you go into the 90s, slowly, actually, we built up our trust levels. And then, somewhere around the 90s, 2002 down, right, our trust levels were either increasing or very high, because cannot increase further. 90 plus, how can we increase further, right? As I said, 99 is fake figure, right? So 90 plus is pretty like as high as we can go, right? 95, 96. But trust can change suddenly, not just gradually. What that means is that it may be so high, if let's say there's a trust erosion next year, don't think 96 will become 86. It can all the way go down suddenly to 60 or 50, You may think that David is talking nonsense. You can look at the past 5 years, our data always 90 plus. Right? Let me tell you that that is the biggest danger. Okay, the research is very clear that trust need not be gradual. It's not like, oh, damn it, SPF like that, go down slowly. It can be like that all the way, then zoom, suddenly goes down. So don't expect a trajectory that's always linear or gradual, both increasing or decreasing. What that means for us is, for the planning research people, right, is don't be too confident in the trends and analysis. Don't go and say, I look at my 5-year SPF, my data is so good. David, you are just causing panic. Right? Next year, even though we do badly, even we have a few corruption cases, so 96 go down to 80 plus are still the best in Asia, right? You will be wrong, right? Because that can bring it down suddenly. So my caution to everybody that just because it hasn't happened, don't think it won't happen. And when it happened, usually you'll be much more shocked than you anticipated. Just to reinforce my point. This slide I be confidential. It's okay to be video recorded, but I'll frame it in a particular way. I have done work in Singapore with our public service across many agencies, actually including you guys. Okay? And I'm confident to say what I'm about to say now. And that is that the public service thinks the trustworthiness of the public service is at this level. Right? When I ask you, do you think the public trusts you, you actually bring the level a little bit down. Because you all understand that sometimes the public don't see why I do this. Sometimes the public has fake information. So if you think that you are trustworthy 9 out of 10 points, right? When I ask you, do you think the public trusts you? You are quite sensible. You will say, I think the public trusts me 8 or 7.5. Then when I ask the public, do you trust them? Ask the public, that is probably about 6 or 7. In other words, we think we are this trust, objective trust level. We think the public trusts me, actually the public trusts you lower. So we also even though we temper our own trustworthiness, we actually still overestimate the level of trust that people have in us. Let me translate this to leadership, right? You could be the commander, the director, you have a perception of how your employees trust you. I'm sad to say, to bring the news that you probably want to look at that level, the actual trust is a little bit lower. Okay? And that actually, that falls out in empirical data. It means that the trust is always not really what you expected, and unfortunately, more fragile than you thought, a bit lower than you thought, right? Even though you are doing very well. The good news is that it doesn't mean that the past trends are useless, they are still relevant data. It also doesn't mean that trust is random, I can't do anything about it, but it does mean that trust is not predetermined. Right? It doesn't mean that because there's social media and all trust will invariably go down. That's another narrative that I want to warn people against it. I always say that to ministers. No, you should not say that because it's trust in government all over the world is eroding, so it is kind of expected, next year that you see our trust also will be so high. Right? Whether you think there's a nice political narrative is a separate question. Right? It's not a given that trust must go down. Right? So you should not say that, well, it's okay, but nowadays with social media, I would expect public trust of police to not always be high and it will go down. That kind of thinking, I think is a little bit too complacent, a little bit externalizing it and say because social media, so our trust can never be so high. Then you are not giving yourself a chance to maintain your high trust level. So just to round up, right, trust is really a process. Right? We need to understand that it can be eroded very easily. Hopefully we have some time to chat about this. Need to understand how you can repair trust. Repair trust doesn't mean you apologize. Apologize is one of the ways, but there are sincere apology and insincere apologies that people can suss up. Right? So I've written articles on how to apologize sincerely and how not to apologize when you will be perceived as insincere. So quite important. Apology is not the only way to repair trust, for example, and how you develop trust and so on. So these are the sort of the second last slide. I want to just show this to you. If you're a researcher or a leader, I would suggest these 6 things that you think about it as your roadmap. You don't have to do all 6, but as a researcher, I would want to do all 6 in my whole program of a lifetime of research on trust. But for you, if you want to develop trust, right, these are the 6 things I think you need to consider to focus on. Don't just ask people, do the officer trust me, do the public trust police? Ask yourself which dimension of trust you are looking at. Because the predictors of competence is different from integrity, from benevolence. So you must ask yourself, given the most immediate thing I have, this task force I'm looking at trust, don't just say how am I going to increase public trust in SPF. Which dimension of trust are we talking about? Because to increase the public trust on your police competence is different things to do compared to integrity and benevolence and so on. Right? You want all 3, which are the one that is most dangerous now that you quickly need to work on. Right? So prioritize by looking at the dimensions of trust. Understand what are we talking about, the content, the trust. I've talked about trust and distrust. Distrust is low trust, right? Then there's mistrust, right? Mistrust is high trust of people that you should not trust. So if you trust Trump, it is mistrust. Right? If you trust Trump, it's mistrust, right? If you trust, I cannot even give another president. if you trust someone that you should trust, then it's high trust, right? If you don't trust someone that you should trust, like the police, right? Then you're dealing with distrust. But you have to deal with people trusting people that things that you should not trust, such as certain fake information or bad leader, right? Like public intellectual, people call me public intellectual, I don't feel flattered. Because I explained to them that public intellectual means people can, from your words and thoughts, influence others, and that's a neutral thing, right? You can be a horrible person, spreading lies, and still a public intellectual, right? Because so long as you can influence people's thoughts and minds and action with words, right? That makes you a public intellectual. So there are a lot of things people around that we want to deal with is trust, trusting where we should. People trusting the target when we shouldn't trust. Very quickly, the trust in transition is a concept that I came up with 15 years ago or so, right? That is not only in the research literature, but it's very applicable to you, and I told the minister, very applicable to the government, right? Trust in transition refers to, you won't find this in the literature, it refers to a situation that what do you do when someone violates your trust, but you have a very strong trust level of that person all this while. Come again, huh? So I always use Jerry example because it's right in front of me. Let's suppose I know Jerry very well, and I do know him quite well, right? And I trust him all along. We have worked together and everything, correct? It's just like people trusting PAP, people trusting the police, we actually have a very high trust for many years, and that's important quickly. Then one fine day, I heard or I found out, or Jerry said something that I know, that according to my rationality, it violates my trust. Right? Not just Jensen gossip to me. I actually heard something, and then I go and get actually it sounds true. So given the evidence as a rational person, now my trust in Jerry is supposed to be threatened, right? But my trust in him will not suddenly zoom down, because I have years of experience with him that I trusted him. This is called trust in transition. You suddenly panic, you don't know what to do. Very terrible state, ambivalent. It's just like you trusted your boyfriend, girlfriend, or spouse, then suddenly you heard the person cheated on you. But you really trusted this person. But the evidence before you with a photograph sounds like it's having somebody inside the car, right? And everything sounds like converge. You don't immediately lose your trust in your spouse. You are in an ambivalent situation. You feel conflicted. Do I trust or don't trust what is going on? This is called trust in transition. I wrote about that in the newspaper article. And many of us, you may face that situation. When I trust the police all this while, suddenly something happened. I don't suddenly lose the trust in the police. I panic, I will be in an ambivalent, conflicted situation. Why am I studying this concept? Because that is when I'm most vulnerable. When I need to decide, should I trust Jerry or not? At that period, this is a terrible state to me. I need to decide I trust him or I don't trust him. At that time, my rationality gives way to my emotion, right? Because my emotion is dominating. So all I need is Jensen for me to tell me either one way or the other. I will tend to be more influenced by Jensen during that period, because I want to decide, should I trust Jerry or not trust Jerry. So whatever Jensen says can influence me much more powerful than a normal time. Right? Similarly, when I don't know whether to trust the SPF or not, I'm in ambivalent because I've been trusting you. I am now, even though I have a PhD, I will be very easily influenced by any additional information. That would mean that your PAP needs to work extra hard. Right? You need to now extra convince that not only the first one, but come up with a very convincing story. And I, as a public, will be more likely to go with that story because I don't want to be in this conflicting situation. Okay, this is extremely powerful because you have been a period of trust with this person. Right? And I think that is something that I've been working on, and I think it applies to our government, it applies to you, right? Because you have a history of high levels of trust. When you have a violation, a lot of people will be trust in transition. And that is when they are very susceptible to influence. You probably want to have a contingency plan like RAS. You probably have a risk assessment and horizon scanning situation for things like that. How you repair trust, how you develop and increase trust. Okay, I will finish with this one. There are two pairs of P's I think we can approach trust. I put the symbol N instead of A and B, otherwise you will read PAP. So there are two pairs of P's. So I think it's important for us to be very principled, right? We must have a set of principles, but we have to be pragmatic, right? Depending on the situation. But what is pragmatic to you is often lack of principles to the public. So when you are pragmatic, you cannot just say I'm pragmatic. Actually, when you are pragmatic, you are not giving up the principle, right? You need to then be able to show the public that being pragmatic doesn't mean I'm giving up the principle. It's not easy. So the idea of when you change something, you need to be a principle. We were talking at lunch, right? That when we make a new decision, you need not be a policy U-turn. It could be in the light of information, I decide to do something quite different from what I did. I change my decision now because of new information. If I don't, then that is called maladaptiveness, right? So distinguish a U-turn from being adaptive and so on, right? And without trust, people will say it's U-turn, flip-flop, roti prata, right? But if you have the trust, then people can understand that principles and pragmatic go go hand in hand. You need to prevent negative things and aspire and promote positive things. That's the guideline for increasing trust. You need to be pluralistic. In other words, look at things from different points of view. Right? Government has been trying very hard on 377A, trying to be pluralistic, right? They actually have their own personal values, but they put that aside and try to look at things from how different groups look at it. Similarly, we need to be pluralistic. How our officers, male officers, female officers look at things will be a bit different. Administrative staff and uniform officer will look at things differently and so on. So, able to take that paradoxical ways of understanding that there's not just one truth, that there are different truths as perceived by different people. Right? Be people-centric, take people perspective, like all the very basic things that Jensen and company will know that should have the SPF with, right, on how to increase all these ways of increasing trust. So, if you're interested, especially for the researchers people, the P&O people, don't just look at trust. When you want to study trust, look at research on fairness perception. When people think that you're not dealt with fairly, you don't talk about trust anymore. Right? Fairness is a fundamental issue about trust. So you need to understand fairness. Don't need to reinvent the wheel. Right? We have done so much things. We need researchers on fairness. We know what the psychology of fairness is. Right? An outcome may be unfair, but if your process is fair, you can actually mitigate outcome unfairness. So outcome fairness, process fairness are two different things, right? Judges will know your procedural justice and your distributive justice distinction. How to understand negativity and positivity. One quick example. Most of you have a PA, right? Secretary, right? You know what this example that I'm about to give, right? That negativity looms, right? If you scold your PA one time, and then you praise her another time, she's not neutral to you, right? Because -1 and 1 is not 0. Okay? From my own experience, you scold her once, you've got to praise her about 27 times. So, the negativity bias is very important, right? All of us, including you and me, right? Negativity looms. The negative is more powerful than the positive, all other things equal. There's an evolutionary basis to this, because when we see tiger, you better react faster and run, right? So we are built up in a way, our brains are wired in a way that we respond stronger to negative things than positive things. At the same time, we know how to promote positive things, so we just need to balance the two and understand. One quick example, since I don't have meet you regularly. One quick example of leadership OD. If you want to give negative feedback to your officer, and you think a negative feedback is quite jialat, don't go and tell him to come in on Monday, give him half the feedback, and then come in on Wednesday, give him the other half. So if you break your feedback into smaller chunks, he hates you much more than you tell him everything on Monday. So don't tell him the negative feedback in appraisal, break it up into multiple sessions, tell him once. You just have to figure a way to make it manageable. Just like you want to increase GST, can you please don't break it into 2 parts? Because the negativity lingers, you know. But the second time, the first one is still around. And then just make sure we know about people's identities, you know, how to deal with the groups, how to increase people's well-being and so on. I don't have time to go into any of these. I just want to share with you. This slide is more for researchers. Please don't reinvent the wheel. We know so much in the science, and you can use it to develop your SPF trust. Alright, last statement. I wrote this everywhere at goal. In order to understand and enhance trust, we really need to appreciate it's very fragile. But then if we know how to deal with it, it's very, very powerful. Okay? And I hope that will be our guiding principle, right? That trust is very fragile. Don't be too complacent. But when we know how to deal with it, it's extremely powerful. Right? Trust is free. You know? Trust HR people. You don't need a lot of budget to increase a lot of things. You need to increase trust. Right? When our employees trust each other and trust the management, you get a much more outcome better for everyone, including the employees themselves, than just doing a bit, pouring more and more money into welfare programs, for example. Okay, so trust is very, very powerful if we do it well. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Chan, for that wonderful and insightful sharing. Yeah.